Hi, everyone. Thanks for being here in person or virtually. And thanks especially to Teresa and Denis for hosting me while I'm here. It's nice to have an international vacation once in a while. I do consider myself a resident of the Pacific Northwest, living in the Seattle area for a good part of my childhood after we came from living overseas. And then I moved to Oregon to go to graduate school and lived there ever since. But certainly plenty of trips to British Columbia when I was growing up. One of which was when I was in high school, I was in the band. And every year on Victoria Day, our whole band came up to Victoria to march in the parade, the Victoria Day parade. And so that was always a big event in the teenage years, my teenage years, and had lots of fun doing that. So I do consider myself kind of a resident citizen of the region, and I try to ignore political boundaries just because they don't really mean that much. It's the geography and the climate and the flora and fauna that mean a lot more. I'm going to be talking tonight about ferns of the Pacific Northwest, and ferns have been a particular interest of mine since I was young, and saw ferns growing in the woods around Seattle. And I studied the fern genus Cryptogramma for my master's thesis, so that's part of my background there. I'm going to try to cover the basics so that we're all up to speed on what a fern is, what the fern life cycle is, and fern biogeography. And I'm going to go through in a decent amount of detail to describe a small number of commonly encountered species that if you walk around in the forest and the open spaces around here, you'll probably see them all. But that's really only a small fraction of our overall fern flora. We have a lot of species here in this region, but you kind of have to know where to go to find that diversity within a genus, all of the species in the genus, and then also all of the genera that can be found. If you look through the references, you see that there's a lot of species that you wouldn't necessarily commonly encounter on a walk in the woods. So just starting with what is a fern, and ferns generally have a very kind of typical or familiar kind of morphology, a branching pattern. They're pinnately compound, and so that's something that it's a visual cue that everybody understands. But there's lots of subtle variations that distinguish the different genera and different species, and so that's a challenge that a lot of people have, is kind of really getting to the point where they can identify individual species. But you can usually identify a fern because the leaves are coiled. And you can see in this photo the tip of a newly emerging frond that's curved like a fiddle head, the head of a fiddle. There are other kinds of plants, flowering plants, that have the same shape of leaves, pinnately compound, particularly members of the carrot family or the parsley family. But they don't have this type of uncoiling young frond. Plus they have flowers and fruits. Now ferns are higher vascular plants. They have vascular tissues that conduct water and nutrients, just like flowering plants, just like conifers, all the seed plants. But what's distinctive about ferns and some of the related species are that the spores are the dispersing reproductive propagule. And spores are haploid in the life cycle of all these organisms that reproduce sexually. There's a diploid phase and a haploid phase, and it's based on the number of chromosomes in individual cells. I'll get into that a bit more. But the gametophyte generation in ferns occurs independently of the sporophyte. That's not really the case in seed plants. So the gametophytes are these little, for most ferns, these little green things that look like a liverwort, basically, and that's what generates the new fern sporophyte. The sperm and the eggs are produced on the gametophytes. And I'll talk briefly about horsetails and club mosses, which have been considered fern allies. It turns out that club mosses are not very closely related to ferns, and horsetails are. So now, typically, the term that people
Excuse me, Ed. We can't see your face. We can only see your chest in the microphone.
Thank you, and because Teresa, I'm a little taller than she is, and I'll adjust it. How does that work? How's that work?
Oh, I didn't know that your face was visible at all because you got your screen share. Okay, so.
That's good. We can see you now. Thank you.
Am I in a little box in the corner of the screen?
Yes.
It's all good now. It's all good.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, I'm going to mute everybody. Oops. Sorry. So, and now I'll have to unmute you. Oh no, you're not. Are you? Can you speak?
Yeah.
Okay.
Are you hearing me? Okay, great. Okay, so yeah, let's do a little brief overview of the fern life cycle. If you ever took a college biology class, you've probably seen this type of a diagram. But in the center of the diagram, the drawing, there is a fern plant. This is a species of Polypodium. And the leaves of a fern, we call them fronds. And you can see the horizontally creeping rhizomes in the illustration. Some ferns have creeping rhizomes where the fronds arise individually from the rhizome. Some have very short rhizomes where the fronds are in a clump. And there's an inset close-up of a portion of a fern frond. It's called a pinna with the sori located on it. In this case, Polypodium, the sori do not have any indusium covering them. There's no tissue covering them, but a lot of other kinds of ferns do. And then continuing clockwise direction, there's a close-up of a single sporangium. And so you can see that there are spores that are produced in the sporangium. And these kind of more advanced ferns, there's 64 spores per sporangium. Those spores are released into the air, and if they land in a suitable location, they'll germinate and form a prothallus, a little gametophyte that is the structure, the green structure that produces the gametes, the sperm and the egg. And ferns need water for the sperm to swim from the, to the place where the eggs are located on the gametophyte, and that creates fertilization. And then in the upper left of the diagram, there's a little new fern plant growing from the gametophyte. And gametophytes are actually hard to find in nature, and I think that's partly because many of our ferns are very long-lived. But the best place to look for fern gametophytes is a damp trail bank, where there's a cut bank. Trail is cutting horizontally across a slope. That's where to look for fern gametophytes. So look for them next time you're out. Talk a little bit about relationships, and then the term phylogeny is what's used these days to kind of show the evolution of different plant groups. And here's relationships diagrammatically of different types of plants, starting with the liverworts, mosses, and hornworts. Those are plants where the main obvious plant growth is the gametophyte, and the sporophytes are very reduced. It's kind of the opposite of the higher plants. And then the next stage in the center of the diagram, those are the lycophytes, club mosses, spike mosses, quillworts, which I'll talk about a little bit later. And then ferns are actually more closely related to seed plants, gymnosperms and angiosperms, than they are related to the lycophytes. The lycophytes are very ancient lineage. What this does not show is all the extinct lineages of vascular plants that are documented in the fossil record. And then here's another similar diagram, but it's just rotated 90 degrees, just to show in more detail the relationships of the different groups of ferns and lycophytes relative to seed plants, which are spermatophytes at the bottom of the diagram. And of all the different groups that are shown here, the Polypodiales, most of our species are in that group. We have a few others, but in the tropics, there's much more diversity at this level of order. Okay, now on to fern biogeography, and this is the map that the information in the introduction about patterns of fern biogeography comes from, and it's a color diagram showing by color the species richness based on, I think, a 50-kilometer grid cell. And so within each 50-kilometer square, how many species are documented to occur in that area or are expected to occur in that area? And so yellow is the fewest, dark blue is the most. And you can see that in North America, the places with the high diversity are the northeastern part of the US and adjacent Canada, Florida in the southeast, the southwest, particularly the mountains in Arizona, New Mexico, and Texas, very high diversity there, which isn't something that you might necessarily think about when you think about ferns. And then in the Pacific Northwest, throughout the mountainous regions, but then particularly in southwestern British Columbia and northwestern Washington, a real high concentration right where we live.
I'm just blown away that there's so many species.
There are a lot of species, yeah. This is a map showing observations of ferns and lycophytes in the Pacific Northwest from an iNaturalist project that I put together, and you can go check this out if you use iNaturalist. Each red square is an observation or a grid cell where an observation has been made. Now, the most dense areas are partly where people go to, where people live. But this gives you an idea of where there's a lot of ferns and where there's fewer. So the drier, more arid regions in particular, there are fewer ferns, and also, farther north you get, although that's probably a lot of that's just lack of observations. But anyway, you can look at a map like this and it gives you ideas of interesting places to go. So I'm going to spend some time talking about 7 species of common ferns of lowland forests. And probably some of you know all of these, but I thought it would be worth going through these just to get everybody operating at the same level as as I go into the last part of the presentation. So let's talk, and they're the western sword fern, Polystichum unitum, bracken, Tridium aquilinum, ours is variety pubescens, licorice fern, Polypodium glycyrrhiza, the northwestern lady fern, Aetherium felix femina, subspecies cyclosorum, the spreading wood fern, Diopteris expansa, western maidenhair fern, Adiantum ludicum, and deer fern, which is now known as Strithiopteris spicans. So I'll go through each of these and show you some photos and talk about them. So Polystichum unitum, western sword fern, this is really our most abundant fern, a dominant species in many types of forest communities in the Pacific Northwest, west of the Cascade Twist Mountain Crest. And it's a very statuesque plant, and I think we kind of take it for granted, actually, because it's so ubiquitous. My experience growing up was that it self-sowed in the cracks of the rockwork on the walk up to our front door. It was that ubiquitous. And it has fronds that are once pinnate, but if you look closely, the individual pinnae are connected to the main axis of the frond, the costa, by a stalk, just a narrow stalk, by the rachis. Let's see, the Sori have a peltate indusium. I don't really have a photo that shows that well, but that's something to learn to look for if you're trying to identify ferns. Good to have a hand lens with you. Second, I'll do licorice fern, Polypodium glycyrrhiza. It's called licorice fern because the creeping rhizome, if you were to break off a little piece and taste it, it has a licorice flavor, and that's unique to our species of Polypodium. The phenology, the seasonality of these species is kind of the opposite of most of our plants. The new fronds come up typically in the summer, late summer, early fall, and they're unfurling as the rainy season begins, and then they're green all winter. And then the spores are released in the middle of winter. In February is when the spores are released. So it's adapted to our climate, and it's part of a group of species, a couple more in California, that have this phenology pattern. Like I said, with Polypodium, there's no indusium covering the sporangia in the Sori. And this typically grows on trees. So it's our main fern that grows as an epiphyte. But it'll also grow on cliffs, on rocks, or on soil. Number 3 here is lady fern, Aetherium felix femina, subspecies cyclosorum. And the species is widespread around the northern hemisphere, including in Europe and eastern North America. Now this fern is deciduous, so it starts active growth in the spring, it's green all summer, and then in the fall it dies back. So notice how I'm talking about phenology, and that's a good feature to learn in terms of being able to identify plants. These fronds are more finely dissected, they're bipinnate. In the shape, the frond outline is widest in the middle and narrow at the base. Now, a fern that looks kind of similar and can be confused until you know what to look for is the wood fern, the spreading wood fern, Diopterus expansa. And, they're different. The sori have a different shape. I should have said that before. The lady fern, the sori a little bit more elongate. And in Diopterus expansa, they're circular. This species typically grows on logs and stumps, decaying wood. And if you see a fern growing on decaying wood, there's a really good chance that it's this species. But the thing to really look for is the base of the frond is where the widest pinnae are. So the shape is kind of triangular, as opposed to lady fern, which is narrower at the base. Okay, now I'll go to what we call deer fern. In North America, in Europe, the same species is called hard fern. I'm not actually sure why that's the case. I should look that up sometime. Used to be placed in the genus Blechnum. Now Blechnum has been split up and we're calling it Strithiopterus blechnum. And it's evergreen and clumping like the common sword fern, but there's some differences. And one is that the fronds are pinnatopid. So the individual pinnae are not attached with a stalk, they're attached along their entire length. But more importantly is that the fronds are dimorphic. So you see in this photo, the fertile fronds are upright and their pinnae are very narrow. And the vegetative fronds or the sterile fronds are kind of more spreading and form a rosette, and their pinnae are wider. So that pattern of frond dimorphism, where the fronds that have the spores look different from the fronds that don't have spores, that's a recurring theme in ferns, and learning that is another part of the skill set that you want to have to be able to identify ferns. Bracken fern, ours is variety pubescens, which is found in Western North America, but there are a number of varieties around the world. It's a deciduous fern. The fronds are often very large and very highly dissected. The rhizome is creeping, so the fronds arise singly, just one at a time. And in this case, the sori are located along the edges of the pinnae, which you can sort of see in the photo. And they're protected by the edge of the margins of the pinnae. Bracken is pretty common and in some cases considered to be a weed. And then the last one I'm going to talk about is our maidenhair fern. And this is the western maidenhair, Adiantum eluticum. In former times, it was known as Adiantum pedatum variety eluticum. And, but more recently, it's been found that it's distinct from the species in eastern North America, which is Adiantum pedatum. It's deciduous, it's clumping, and it has this unusual frond architecture. The term for it is pseudopedate. It kind of looks like, a hand. One of the common names is five-finger fern. So with the fingers coming off of a hand. Those of you on Zoom, I'll put my hand here. Hope you can see that. And the sori are located along the edge of the pinnules, and they're covered by a false indusium, and that's really leaf tissue that is folded over, kind of forming a flap. So you can see that in the photo on the left. And this is a really interesting fern. I'm not really going to be able to go into its mysteries in a lot of detail, but there's a lot to learn from it and travel and explore and see. Okay, so that's a basic primer on ferns in the Pacific Northwest. That's a good start if you know those 7. But then if you decide you want to learn more than 7, how do you do that? And that it really means you need to explore habitat diversity. And when I was at that stage, and this was kind of after my first year of botany class, and I saw in the books there are all these species and I'd never seen them. You know, I kind of, where do you go to see these plants? And of course, in those days there was no internet, so there's no way to look it up. But somebody told me about the Perry Creek Trail in Snohomish County, Washington. And so this photo was taken during my first visit to the Perry Creek Trail in 1979. And it's a very diverse place. There's nearly 30 species of ferns and lycophytes that have been found along this trail. Some of them are very hard to find. There aren't very many plants. So you kind of have to know where to look, but it's definitely a place to visit. And one of the interesting ferns that grows there is a relative of our common sword fern. This is Polystichum andersonii, Anderson's sword fern. And it's kind of an uncommon species. I wouldn't say it's rare, but maybe it's partly because it grows in places that are hard to get to in the mountains. And it's also interesting because there are these little bulblets that form on near the tips of the fronds, right along the rachis. And when the fronds die down and lie in the ground, new plants will grow from these little bulblets, just vegetatively. And so sometimes you can see sort of a ring of new plants around the edge of the old ones. So vegetative reproduction. Now, within the genus Polystichum, there is quite a bit of diversity, and show you some other examples that you can seek out. On the left, we have the imbricate sword fern, Polystichum imbricans, and this is a close relative of Polystichum unitum that has this very different morphology in that the fronds are stiff and they're upright, and the individual pinnae are kind of rotated relative to the axis, sort of like louvers on Venetian blinds. And this is a plant that grows in really open, dry, rocky habitats. And so it's adapted to those conditions, to drought conditions. And you can find this growing on the east side of Vancouver Island. It's not uncommon around Victoria, but also in the Cascades on both sides. Well, actually more on the east side of the Cascades in Washington and southward, and then down in California, it's actually very common. And then on the right, the Polystichum there is the holly fern, Polystichum longitis. And this is once pinnate also, but the individual pinnae are very spiny. They're almost like the leaf of a holly plant, holly tree. And this is a mountain plant. You wouldn't see it in the lowlands. The lowest pinnae are like little triangles, and so that's the best character for distinguishing it. This is a widespread species around the northern hemisphere. It's also in Europe. Even more interesting and unusual, we have Polystichum lemonii, and the one on the left here. And this species only grows on serpentine rock. I'll talk about this a little bit more later. But it's very finely dissected and also has that kind of louvered character to it that allows it to grow out in full sun. This is a pretty uncommon species from Northern California through Oregon and Washington, but very scattered, and then also known from maybe only one site in British Columbia. And then the one next to it is Polystichum krukerbergii. And this is also a mountain species, mostly in the subalpine. And it's actually arose from hybridization between Polystichum lemonii and Polystichum longitis. And so it's kind of in between in morphology. And I'll be talking more about that process of how new species are created by hybridization, because it's an important pattern of evolution in ferns. And knowing that helps you to understand and identify plants in the field. Polystichum krukerbergii is named after Art Krukerberg, who was a longtime botany professor at University of Washington, and one of the first people I met when I started getting interested in plants. And his wife, Maureen, had a nursery, and she was very much interested in ferns. So that was part of my entry into the local fern world by meeting them. We have some other interesting species of Polystichum. The one on the left, Polystichum dudleyi, this is actually a California endemic. Notice how finely dissected the fronds are, very deeply dissected. This is mostly found in redwood forests in the Coast Range of California, pretty limited distribution, 100 miles north of San Francisco to 100 miles south. And it has formed a hybrid species with Polystichum imbricans that is Polystichum californicum. And that's the one on the right. And it's not quite as deeply dissected, but it is dissected. And it's found from California north into southern British Columbia. There's a few sites on Vancouver Island, and I think Texada Island also.
Are they all evergreen like the?
Yes, they're all evergreen. In some species of Polystichum and other evergreen species, the fronds actually last for 2 years, not just one, but for 2. I'll get back to Polypodium. I talked about the licorice fern, which is on the left here. But this process of new species being formed by hybridization. We have another Polypodium relative in the mountains, Polypodium amorphum, called, I guess, the Montane polypody. And notice how it has very narrow pinnae, and the tips are very rounded. And their species, their ranges do overlap a bit, and they have hybridized, and the hybrids have basically by doubling their chromosomes, they become fertile species that have double the number of chromosomes as their parents. And Polypodium hesperium is the name of the species that has originated by hybridization between Lysthryza and the amorphum. Now, what's interesting about this is that this must have happened a long time ago, because Polypodium hesperium is found throughout Western North America, from Arizona north to British Columbia. Very wide range, a much wider range than either of the 2 parent species. So it speaks to both the kind of the abilities that these new species arising from hybridization have in terms of adaptability, able to grow over large regions, but also this probably happened a long time ago, and it's over that time, million years or something, it's been able to spread widely. And within Polypodium in particular, there's a number of examples of these in the right of the diagram on the screen under 4N. Those are tetraploid species that arose from hybridization between different species with just 2 sets of chromosomes, diploid species. And because of this, these are really difficult to identify, actually. And you need to look at the technical keys to get the characters. You at least need to have a hand lens. And the easiest way is if you actually have a specimen and you're looking under a dissecting scope. So they're definitely a challenge in the field. Now I'm going to talk a little bit more about different places that have examples of diversity. And so I'm going to take you on a tour, I guess you might say, of a place that's in my backyard. It's called Spencer Butte. It's a 2,000-foot butte just south of Eugene. And so in the background of this photo, you can see the city of Eugene at the southern end of the Willamette Valley. And Spencer Butte is a city park, and it was protected in the 1930s to save it from being logged. But it has amazing native flora. And these dry, open, rocky habitats in particular have great fern diversity. So it's a great place to go. And for me, I can drive to the trailhead in 20 minutes, and it's another maybe half-hour hike up to the summit. So I can do that anytime. So one of the species I'll show you is a species of woodsia. Cliff brake, I guess, is a common name for woodsia. This is Woodsia scopulina, the Rocky Mountain cliff brake. And this is a very common species east of the Cascades and in the interior, very uncommon west of the Cascades. And this is one of the places where you can easily see it west of the Cascades. So it's kind of fun to see. Another one is the parsley fern, Cryptogramma acrosticoides. I'm going to be going into a whole set of what you could call rock ferns. They're small, they're adapted to dry conditions. They're very drought tolerant. Oftentimes they curl up, they shrivel up in the dry part of the summer, and then when the rains start again, they just uncurl. Notice here in this photo that this is another fern that is dimorphic. The fertile fronds are upright and the individual segments are narrow compared to the sterile fronds that lie more flat and have more leaf area. Their job is to photosynthesize. Fertile fronds' job is to make spores and spread spores. So that kind of helps you understand why this pattern of dimorphy occurs. And this is a genus that I studied for my master's thesis in graduate school. A similar plant, but it looks similar, but it's not dimorphic, is Aspedotus densa. This has a number of common names. Serpentine fern is one of them because wherever you find serpentine, you find this species, but it's not restricted to serpentine. The common name that I like the most is Indian's Dream. You'll see that in some of the books. I really don't know why it's called that. I would like to find out someday. If any of you know, let me know. Another one of these rock ferns is the goldback fern, Pentagramma triangularis, and it's monomorphic and very triangular outline, with the lowest pinny being the widest. And then on the underside, and maybe you can see in a few spots the underside, but there's a waxy indiment. It's either whitish or goldish. That's where the name goldback fern comes from. It's Pentagramma triangularis. And then another rock fern that looks very different, but in the same family. These are all members of the Pteridaceae, all these rock ferns. It used to be a genus Chiolanthes. Now it's Myriopterus gracillima, lace fern. And if you look up close, this fern has very small pinnules, very tiny. And each frond has hundreds of little pinnules. So it's very delicate, sort of like lacework, I guess. That's how it got its name. So that's a great place to see a lot of diversity of ferns that you wouldn't see if you on a walk through the woods. Now what I'm going to do is take you through another genus that has quite a bit of diversity, but the species are all pretty uncommon. And you have to really seek them out to find them. And that's the genus Pelea. This is cliffbreak. So I'll start on the shores of Lake Chelan. This is in the North Cascades of Washington on the just east of the Cascade Crest. And Lake Chelan is this amazing 50-mile long lake. It's like a fjord, freshwater fjord. Of course, there's a lot of lakes like this in British Columbia, so it's no big deal here, but in Washington, there aren't many lakes like this. But I did a botanical survey of the portion of the area along this lake a number of years ago, and one of the things that we found in the survey was this cliff break, the Sierra cliff break, Pelea brachyptera. It had never been documented from Washington before. And in fact, it's very disjunct from the main part of its range, which is the Sierra Nevada of California into southern Oregon. The very northernmost locations in the main part of its range, just southeast of Eugene in Lane County, Oregon. And then there's a gap all the way north to Chelan County. So that's an interesting thing about fern biogeography, is that there can be these disjunctions. Ferns have these spores that are very light and can get up into the air and travel a long distance. And that's one possible explanation for why we have this isolated area. There's actually quite a number of populations within about a 20-mile area on the upper tip of Lake Chelan. Another one that is scattered around here, but at lower elevations, drier places, is like Pelea glabella, the smooth cliff break. And notice how these ferns have kind of a bluish green color to the foliage. That's a characteristic of this genus Pelea. Pelea glabella, this particular is the subspecies simplex, and I found it growing on basalt cliffs along the Columbia River in central Washington. There's a similar species. I think this does grow in British Columbia as well, but it might be a different subspecies. Pelea bridgesii is another species that is, I don't think it's in British Columbia. I don't think it's in Washington, but it's in Oregon in the Wallowa Mountains, and it's in Idaho. This is where I found it in Idaho. And it's a species that grows on granite rocks. And then this last one is Pellia breweri, which often grows on limestone, not always. Sometimes it's on volcanic rocks that must have relatively high pH. That is pretty uncommon, but also scattered. I think this is in British Columbia, Pellia breweri. And there's also Pellia gastonii, which is in southeastern British Columbia. I've never seen that one. I haven't been able to get to it. So quite a bit of diversity within this genus, but it's not one that you're going to encounter on a regular basis. You really need to seek it out. Now I'm going to kind of talk about some mountain ferns and take you to a place where I've visited many times over the years, just outside of Snoqualmie Pass. So this is about an hour's drive east of Seattle, and so kind of in my backyard. And there's a lake called Snow Lake, and it has a very popular trail to it. It is probably the most heavily trafficked trail in the Washington Cascades. There can be hundreds of cars in the parking lot on a weekend, summer weekend. But it's also a great place to see plants and ferns. And so this is another parsley fern, Cryptogramma, and this is a group that I studied for my graduate degree. And I actually named this species, Cryptogramma cascadensis. And I distinguished it from Cryptogramma acrosticoides, which we already saw earlier. The most obvious difference would be obvious late in the year. This species is completely deciduous. Cryptogramma acrosticoides has sterile fronds that are evergreen. They stay green all winter. And there's some other sort of subtle characters of some of the pubescence that you need a hand lens to look at. So this is, it is in the southern edge of British Columbia and south in the Cascades to Northern California, and also in the Northern Rocky Mountains. Now also in this location, it's a good place to see the subalpine lady fern. So this is a relative of our common lowland lady fern, but you only find it in the mountains. It's almost always on talus slopes, open rocky slopes where there's some moisture. And it's distinctive looking, it's more finely dissected, and now to me it's more attractive, more interesting than our common lady fern. Just maybe because I don't see it as much. That's a Therium distentifolium variety americana. Also at this site, there are several species in the Thalipteris family. And this one looks actually a lot like lady fern. It's another lady fern lookalike. It has that same outline to it where the lowest pinny are smallest, and so kind of whitest in the middle. The genus is Oreopteris quelpartensis. And the Thalipteris family in general can be recognized because there's usually hairs on the fronds. It's the pubescence that's noticeable, whereas lady fern doesn't have pubescence. It has some scales, but it's not really hairy. And then another species in the Thalipteris family is Thagopteris connectilis. And this has a more triangular outline. As you can see, the outline really doesn't say anything about relationships, but it's just kind of a handy way of recognizing species and kind of going through the list of possibilities. Now, both of these species in some of the older books are placed in the genus Thalipteris, but that genus has been broken up into a number of small genera in recent years. Talk a little bit more about serpentine rocks, so serpentine and associated rocks, including dunite and my mind's going blank, but they'll come to me. They are pieces of the mantle, the Earth's mantle, so buried underneath the crust, that get thrust up to the surface where you have tectonic plates that are meeting. And so there's these little scraps of the mantle that get thrown up to the surface, and they have a very distinctive chemical composition. They're high in magnesium and low in calcium, and that makes it really stressful for most plants to grow. Their physiology is not able to handle it. But there are a number of endemic species that are adapted to grow on serpentine rocks, and then there are also non-endemic species that just do really well. And part of it is that there's less competition. So serpentine, typically there's not much soil development, a lot of barren rock, barren scree. But in this photo, you see a diagonal green band from the upper right to the lower left. And that is an area where there's seepage coming out of the ground and groundwater seepage, and all that green is maidenhair fern. And it's just amazing to see this barren south-facing hillside and this ribbon of lush green maidenhair ferns. And they're there because maidenhair ferns love serpentine and there's moisture. But what happens is, growing in this really exposed environment, you get that kind of louver look to the fronds. And so the fronds are upright, and then the pinnae are rotated like Venetian blinds. And some people have given this a name as a different subspecies, but it's not really been proven that they're genetically different. It's not clear at this point whether the difference is genetic or it's just a function of the environment. There's a lot more to say about maidenhair ferns that I won't be able to get into, but there are other mysteries out there. I'll just leave it at that. And then I already talked about Polystichum lemonii. And again, it's a serpentine endemic. So you have to go to certain places to see it. These photos were taken in the Wenatchee Mountains in the Washington Cascades, just east of the Cascade Crest, between Cle Elum and Leavenworth. And it's really, if you haven't been there, it's a great place to go, really interesting. I need to talk briefly about aquatic ferns, because there are a number of ferns that have completely left the land, and they grow in completely aquatic situations, or in some cases they're kind of seasonally aquatic, wet for part of the year and then they dry out. The reddish growth, the scum, quote unquote, scum growing on this pond, this is a pond, is Azolla, and it's called Mosquito Fern. Here's a close-up of the fronds of the mosquito fern growing with duckweed. So the greenish leaves are, some species of duckweed, but the kind of reddish colored things, those are clumps of Azolla. And the reason they're reddish is because there's a symbiosis going on here in the cells of the Azolla. There's a cyanobacterium that is associated with these ferns, and it fixes nitrogen. And takes atmospheric nitrogen and turns it into a form that's usable by plants. And Azolla is actually used as a natural fertilizer in rice cultivation in Asia. It's basically propagated and added to the rice paddies so that it's producing fertilizer for the rice. So there's a lot of research going on with Azolla. It's a really interesting topic. And then there are a number of other aquatic, genera of aquatic ferns that I don't really have time to go into, but definitely interesting. Moonworts, talk about the genus Botrychium and in the family Ophioglossacea. They are primitive ferns and very diverse group. There's been a lot of active research in the last recent decades. This photo here is of Herb Wagner and Florence Wagner out in the field doing moonwort research, and Florence is holding a specimen that she's just plucked, ready to put it in her Ziploc bag. They were at the University of Michigan. They're both no longer living, but for many years they traveled around North America studying moonworts all around the place, and described a number of new species, and subsequent work using DNA methods has really validated their work that was mostly based on on careful study of morphology in the field and comparing the plants in the field. Okay, so where's the moonwort in this photo? See if you can find it. There actually may be more than one, but right in the very center, there is I think that's Botrychium crenulatum. And there are many species. They're not easy to distinguish. There are keys, but the best way to learn them is in the field. And you end up, because they're so hard to find, you end up just sort of slowly walking around, staring at the ground, or even on your hands and knees. And it's kind of like a moonwort crawl. and people really wonder what you're doing when they see you. These are mostly mountain plants that grow in montane meadows, and they particularly love areas with limestone, calcareous rocks. That's where you find the most species diversity. I could do a whole talk on moonworts, but I won't. Don't have time for that. But then I also wanted to briefly touch on equisetum, the horsetails and scouring rushes. And we have a number of species. Again, horsetails, particularly on the left, equisetum arvense can be very weedy. In Oregon, horsetails are on the noxious weed list, the only native plants that are on the noxious weed list. There's kind of two subgenera, one with these branches off the main stem, and then the other where the main stem is unbranched. And then the spores are produced in these cones at the tips. Some of them, particularly the horsetails, the cone-bearing stalks don't have any chlorophyll, and they're not branched. They come up early in spring. Right now is when you'll see them, and then they die back, and then the vegetative shoots come up separately, and they're visible for the whole growing season. So they're interesting and ancient plants. And now the DNA work is saying that they are actually part of the same branch of evolution as ferns. So we can call them ferns.
So did you say they're native, but they're considered noxious?
Yes. Well, so look at the photo here, and you can see how tenacious one of these horsetails can be. It's growing up through asphalt.
Yeah.
This delicate seeming plant came up through asphalt.
This is probably sacrilege in a talk like this, but I'm working on a project where we have horsetails. Can you get rid of them? And if so, how?
So the question, if you couldn't hear, is whether you can get rid of horsetails if they are coming up in a garden, for example, or a restoration area or something. I don't think you can. There are chemicals that you can use that will knock them back. If you have time, you could try covering the whole area with landscape fabric, cover the whole patch, leave it there for years.
It's a city park. We'll just cover the park. No problem.
Yeah. So they're a challenge. They are a challenge. Sure. And then briefly to touch on the lycophytes, which, as I mentioned, have been called fern allies, but they're not really closely related to ferns, but they are, vascular plants that reproduce by spores. And there are three main groups, the club mosses. And so this is the staghorn club moss, which is our most common species. You can commonly see it in the mountains, particularly in disturbed areas like roadsides, clear cuts, etc. I like this photo because I was able to capture how the spores blow off the strobili, the spore producing structures. You see this cloud of spores coming off of it. In the days before flash bulbs, the way flash photography was done 100 years ago, 150 years ago, was by igniting lycopodium spores. And people would buy packets of spores and put it in a special pan and then set it off with a spark, and it created a flash. And that's how flash photography was accomplished. Yeah. So it's Lycopodium clavatum. Also mossy looking, Lycopodium, they're called club mosses. They aren't mosses though, but they kind of look like mosses. And actually, quite a few of the species will also resemble conifer seedlings. And people will misidentify, they'll say it's a cedar seedling or a pine seedling. One species of Lycopodium, its common name is ground pine. And another one's common name is fir moss. The spike mosses, Selaginella, actually look more like mosses, I would say. They're smaller and form mats like a moss or a liverwort might. But they're vascular plants and they have true roots. And the thing about Selaginella is that they're heterosporous. So a plant produces microspores and megaspores. And so the microspores produce the sperm, and the megaspores produce the egg. So that's kind of a degree of specialization that's not common in seedless vascular plants. Then the third group I'll point out are the quillworts, Isoedes. And these don't look at all like mosses, they look like grasses, is what they look like. And they're aquatic, so this has been uprooted. Sometimes they're in seasonally wet areas, so you could call it amphibious. This is Isoedes natalii, which grows in vernal pools. And they're fairly simple structurally. There's a cluster of leaves coming from something that's almost like a corm, and the spores are produced in around the leaf bases. So you have to kind of pull off a leaf to see a sporangium and see where the spores are located. These also have microspores and megaspores, so they're specialized in that way. So that's a really quick overview of lycophytes. Again, that could be a whole other talk. But now you know. Talk a little bit more about learning about ferns and lycophytes. I've started a project in iNaturalist that you can all look up. You don't actually even have to have an account. That just collects all the observations of ferns and lycophytes from the Pacific Northwest, from British Columbia, Washington, Oregon, Idaho, and Montana, and then also southeastern Alaska. And so you can see there's 147 species that have been documented within that region. That actually includes at least a dozen hybrids, so they aren't all full species. Over 90,000 observations. That map that I showed you with the red squares early on, that was representing 91,575 observations. And it's a good way to just kind of get an overview. You can go through species by species if you want, and look at photos of individual observations that people have posted and sort of get a feel for the variation that's found. If you're old school like me, you like books, and there's a lot of good fern books. This is a very small selection. Robin Moran's book, it's a natural history book, and so all sorts of interesting essays about ferns and kind of their role in history and things like that. It's fun reading. If you're interested in getting a picture of, kind of the ferns that are found all around the northern hemisphere and in the southern hemisphere, where the temperate zone, the Plant Finder's Guide to Garden Ferns is a great introduction to fern diversity. And if you like to grow ferns, that's also useful for that. Martin Rickard is a British fern expert, and it's a great book. And I'm fond of collecting fern floras. Here's a couple of examples. The Ferns of Britain and Ireland by Christopher Page. Just amazing level of detail, morphology, ecology of the ferns in Britain and Ireland, but there's actually a lot of species we have in common, so it's pretty useful here. The Ferns and Fern Allies of Kentucky it's a really great book. Maybe not all that useful here, but I actually have ancestors from Kentucky, so one day I hope to get there to look at the ferns. I've had this book for 40 years and I haven't been there yet, but maybe one of these days. Now the problem though with fern books is that the taxonomy, the names have changed so much that can be really confusing, because there is no book that's up to date. We revised the Flora of the Pacific Northwest, Hitchcock and Cronquist, recently. That was published in 2018, 3 years ago. It's already out of date. There's already names that have been changed. Fortunately, on the website, the Flora website, there's a whole list of updates in errata and things like that. So you can get the latest, but it's not in the book. So that's it for my presentation. I'll be happy to take questions if there's time. And how do we do questions in this hybrid? Maybe we can alternate between Zoom people and people here in person.
So what I'm going to do is allow people to unmute themselves, people can unmute themselves. I will look in the chat for questions. And so, oh, and here's one. Daniel Moskowin says, what is your favorite fern and why is it a peleo?
Thank you, Daniel. Well, I don't think it's possible to have a favorite fern, but my first favorite fern, if we want to phrase it that way, is definitely the maidenhair fern. So I remember finding that in the woods behind our house, and it was one of those things where I'd been walking by it for years, but never noticed it. And then when I did notice it, it struck me, and it's also different looking. So, but you could also say that, my favorite fern is the one that I'm looking at now, too. Any questions from the audience here?
The aquatic ferns, are they, looking in eFlora, I found some places on Vancouver Island. What kind of aquatic places do they like? Are they mostly like vernal places or small pools or?
So the question is about where to find aquatic ferns, and locally, well, I know around Eugene, the azolla is pretty common in slow water along rivers. So sloughs, and actually in some years when it's become really abundant, even in the main river on, just kind of floating down. But typically ponds and sloughs where it's not exposed to much current. So that's a good place to look for azolla, and look for that kind of reddish tinge growing with the duckweed.
And how big is like an individual plant? And are they a triangular shape like a fern, or are they just a?
So the size, probably typically the size of a $50, and they are branched, but it's not like, it doesn't look like a fern really. No, I don't know what to say that it would look like. And then oftentimes they actually are sterile. They don't reproduce by spores, but they break apart into pieces and reproduce vegetatively. And then a little piece can be attached to a duck's foot and be dispersed to the next water body. So that's kind of how they can disperse. Yeah.
So I don't know if this is a non-urban legend or not, but is bracken fern poisonous to livestock? I've heard that. Is there any truth to that?
Yeah, so the question is about bracken fern and is it poisonous? And I think it's, maybe the way to phrase it is it's not good for mammals to eat. I know that there's literature that documents that native people would eat the rhizomes, and they would bake the rhizomes and then extract the starch from the rhizomes. And in some places, I think particularly in East Asia, the fiddleheads are food. People eat the fiddleheads of bracken. And it's been found that consumption of bracken is associated with an increased rate of stomach cancer. So there are chemical compounds that are carcinogenic if you eat enough of it. I've eaten it. I'm still alive.
Are there other poisonous ferns or other ferns that are questionable?
Yeah, well, Robin Moran has an interesting essay in his book, his Natural History of Ferns, about a water fern, a different genus, water clover, Marsilia is a genus, and the sporocarps, the spore-producing bodies, are edible, but can be poisonous under certain circumstances. I don't remember the exact details of it, but you might read that if you're interested, but yeah, so it can be. Are there more questions on our Zoom readers, or should we just keep going here?
I'm sorry, yes, I have several more questions than I wasn't. Okay. Robin asked, I'm curious about Nefutia Strophiopteris. Can you speak of how we're to find it?
Well, yeah, so this is the ostrich fern, Nefutia Strophiopteris, which is widespread around the northern hemisphere. in Europe as well as North America. It's common in Eastern North America, and I think it's kind of scattered in the interior of BC. And then it follows the Fraser River down almost to Vancouver. And I'm not sure if there's really good documentation of exactly how close to Vancouver it gets, but you can find it not too far from here in the river bottoms.
Ray is asking, have there been any findings of gametophytes of the filmy fern Hymenophyllum wrightii closer to Vancouver since the 2015 survey?
Okay, so I do not know the answer to that.
Repeat the question.
Yeah. Are the Zoom people hearing you or not? The people on Zoom, are they hearing you?
I think they're hearing me,
Okay.
but not very well.
Okay, well, I'll still repeat the question. So the question is about the filmy fern that grows in the Pacific Northwest. This is the genus Hymenophyllaceae, which is mainly tropical and kind of warm temperate. And there are a few species in North America. Hymenophyllum wrightii or Mecodium wrightii is found on the Pacific coast. And mostly it's found as gametophytes. And that's one of the things about this particular family is that species are able, the gametophyte stage is long-lived and can actually survive and reproduce vegetatively and persist in the absence of sporophytes. So as far as I know, the only place sporophytes have been found on the Pacific coast is on Haida Gwaii.
Yeah, okay.
But it's native in Japan and common in Japan. Sporophytes are common in Japan. So it's made its way here.
It's so special about it in Japan.
Yeah.
Huh. Interesting.
Yeah. I do know that it was found about 10 years ago on the Olympic Peninsula in Washington. And nobody had any inkling that it could be found in Washington prior to this discovery. But it's there. And it's on Vancouver Island. I just don't know how close to Vancouver it gets. It's, in Washington at least, the places where it's found, it's really only within a few miles of the ocean, where it's really, the high humidity is the key factor. Okay, so I'll take a
I have
question.
the opposite of the previous question here. Is there any ferns that are common, they're not endangered, that you could not mistake them for poisonous ones and are delicious that you could pick and eat?
So the question is about ferns that are good to eat. And
you can't accidentally poison.
Yeah, so the ostrich fern really is the classic edible fiddlehead.
Okay.
And part of the reason is, I think there are probably other ferns where you can eat the fiddleheads, but they're usually covered by scales and just not very pleasant to eat. Whereas ostrich fern doesn't have those. And in the East, ostrich fern is very common, and I think it's even, sold commercially as a food. So the thing to do might be to get some plants to put in your garden at home and then harvest them like an asparagus bed or something. Yeah.
And I have one question. When you were talking about the gametophytes, so there's female gametophytes and male gametophytes, and the sperm swim from the male gametophyte to the female gametophyte, is that correct?
So the question is about gametophytes and how fertilization occurs. And it varies, and it's complicated. So I'll give you the simple version. Most ferns, the way a new fern is created is that two gametophytes get established right next to each other. And the sperm swims from one gametophyte to the neighbor.
Oh, but it's not that one's male and one's female, it's just that.
It's that they require outcrossing to provide that genetic diversity.
And how big are they? Like, would we be, if we went out on a hike, would we be able to look and find them?
A gametophyte is the size of a penny or smaller. And typically you'll see them because they've already produced little sporophytes. So you'll see a little teeny undivided fern frond sticking up from this liverwort looking
And would you
structure.
like mostly find them like kind of under or around where the old fronds had been from the previous year, or?
No, you mostly find them where there's nothing else growing, where there's no competition. And that's why I said that a cut bank on a trail,
Oh, is a good.
is a good place. Or some species on logs, rotting wood.
So I've got in the chat a series of 4 questions. Carolyn asks, so what's the status of isoetes in Washington and Oregon?
The status of isoetes. Well, there's a number of species, and there aren't very many people who can identify them because they all kind of look alike. The best way to identify them is to have a microscope and you look at the ornamentation on the megaspores. And that's not a very good field character. Yeah,
And
so
what's isoetes for the rest of us?
quillworts. Yeah, the lycophytes.
The one that was grass.
Yeah, that look like grass. Yeah. There is a graduate student at UC Berkeley who's been studying them, so there may be some new news that comes out at some point. I'll have to look for that. There's always interesting research going on and new things to learn.
John Martin asks, have you realized any new insights based on the iNaturalist observations?
Well, let's see. So what I've learned most from my naturalists is places to put on my list of places to go visit. But yeah, it's really great for kind of filling in gaps in knowledge of distribution. And the great thing about it is that, people have no idea what they're seeing. We'll take a photo and post it. And, 99% of the time it's something common, but 1% of the time it's something really interesting. And so it's that kind of crowdsourcing concept that is a great way to produce really interesting, useful information.
Daniel Mosquin again. Do any ferns have mycorrhizal relationships?
I think most plants have mycorrhizal relationships. That's just the way plants are. I can't think of any research that I've read that really talks about the details and it being really important. Well, no, I'm thinking of the polypodiales. So another complexity of the life cycle. Lycophytes, lycopods, and the moonworts, Patricium, their gametophytes are completely different. So I was trying not to fill your head with too much information, so that I didn't mention this, but their gametophytes are subterranean and not photosynthetic, and they get their nutrition from mycorrhizae. So the gametophytes of many of these ferns are obligate mycorrhizal associates. And then the sporophytes, the adult plants, may maintain that connection and may still be benefiting as adults, or they may not need it anymore.
Ray and/or Paul asked, it seems to me that our local variety of bracken fern is a lot less invasive than the one in the UK, at least here north of the 49 parallel. Does it rapidly colonize deforested areas in the US as it does in the UK?
So yeah, the question's about bracken fern, and there's a lot of literature from the UK in particular, but Europe in general, and actually other parts of the world. It's really considered a weed, and it takes over and nothing else can grow. And especially, I think in Britain the issue is that the livestock don't like to eat it, and it outcompetes the stuff the livestock do like to eat. So that's why it's considered a problem. I would say that it is certainly capable of coming up in clear cuts and other disturbed areas after fires, but I don't have the sense that it's disruptive ecologically, is maybe a way to think about it. It's part of the natural system. And eventually, trees establish, they grow up, they create shade, the bracken becomes less abundant. Oftentimes it still survives until the next, logging or wildfire or whatever, and then it becomes abundant again.
The last question so far is, with such an ancient group, how much of fern species distribution is due to local conditions, like soil and temperature, and what is the influence of history, like ice age, refugia, etc.?
That's probably a whole other talk into itself. I would say that if you want to generalize, ferns are less, because they can get around with spores, less likely to be associated with refugia in temperate regions, at least. Areas north of the limit of continental glaciation can have very high fern diversity. And if you look at that map that I showed, actually, and if you had a line showing the limit of glaciation, you'd see that there are areas north of that, a lot of areas north of that have high diversity. But there are southern areas that have species that are unique to those areas too. So probably some of both, but maybe not as much as with flowering plants. Any other questions in the room? Still more. Okay, let's.
Is the dominant form of the club moss a gametophyte or a sporophyte?
Yeah, so the question is about club mosses and the green photosynthetic big plant. That's sporophyte. And so that's why, mosses, the green, big green part is a gametophyte.
Yeah.
And the sporophytes are really small. And in club mosses, the sporophyte is what you see and the gametophytes are underground. Very few club moss gametophytes have ever been found. It's just totally by chance that somebody actually digs one up. Yeah. Another question in the room?
Is there any medicinal uses of ferns?
Yeah, it's not something I have much knowledge of.
Oh, yeah.
But because of the doctrine of signatures, have you heard of that term? It was based in like medieval Europe. People thought that herbs were useful on things that looked like the plant. So we have a genus of ferns I didn't even talk about because it's part of that diversity that you need to go and explore by yourself. The common name is spleenwort. Why is it called spleenwort? Because there are species of spleenwort that are shaped like a spleen, and so they must be good for treating problems of the spleen. So off the top of my head, I'm not thinking of any particular, modern examples, but I'm sure they're there.
So we should try.
Okay. Yeah. Well, let's close that. I'm happy to talk with you afterwards too. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
So just a couple of quick closing remarks. Thanks to Ed for a really interesting and informative talk. I've been hoping to get somebody to talk on ferns for several years now, and luckily one of our other speakers suggested Ed, and I'm really so glad that he did, because I think they're such an interesting group and we tend to just overlook them. And I'm now really excited to go out and do some fern exploration. So anybody who's interested in kind of looking for obscure ferns in particular habitats, outing should send an email to Botany, and we'll maybe put some together a bit later in the season. And I also want to extend a huge thanks to our live audience tonight, because it was really wonderful to have people out here in person. So Denise turning the camera on our live audience, and we made it work. The hybrid, we had a few glitches, but I think we're getting better at it every time, and by next fall we should be experts at it.